aspek volatility, uncertainty, complexity dan ambiguity. Ini antara cabaran yang dihadapi oleh kebanyakan negara di dunia, khususnya negara di ASEAN, dan bagaimana untuk kita mengemudi perkara ini bergerak ke hadapan dan apakah cabarannya selaku konteks ASEAN. Dan dalam konteks yang sama, perbezaan antara geoekonomik dan geopolitik yang memaksa syarikat-syarikat untuk merangka semula segala strategi mereka dalam mendepani perbezaan ini. Apakah cabaran yang dihadapi dalam konteks geopolitik? Apakah cabarannya pula dalam geoekonomik? Itu perbincangan kita dalam ASEAN Kita pada episod pada kali ini. Saya bersama dengan Professor Rory Medcalf, iaitu yang merupakan Head of College ANU National Security College. Kita saksikan. I want to ask about the current situation in a world of persistent uncertainty. How should business leaders interpret in terms of today's strategic competition in this region especially, and not just as geopolitics but geoeconomics?
So it's great to be here, and I'm sorry that it's such a confronting topic that we're discussing, because this is a really grim and challenging time, I think, for the region and the world. And I come at this really as a security specialist. I look at economics through the geoeconomic prism, and I think your question is absolutely on the mark. That is, yes, we're in an era of geopolitical competition. In other words, states using power to seek advantage. But this has now translated very clearly into geoeconomic competition. That is, the power that states are using is every aspect of economic power. And we're seeing this most starkly in the tariff shock from the Trump administration. But there's a longer trend, I'd say over at least the past 10 to 15 years, where states have been using economics for strategic advantage. We've seen it in this region, including with the way that China has used its leverage. But we're now seeing, I think, very confrontingly, very starkly, that this dynamic is here to stay. And unfortunately, this is the environment that business has to navigate in.
But have all these countries, especially in ASEAN, adapt to this kind of strategy?
Well, I've certainly watched the way my own country, Australia, has been trying to adapt to this new reality, and we've had partial success over the past 10 to 15 years, but we've still got a very long way to go. Look, I think there's a paradoxical answer to that question, because at one level, of course, we want to attempt to let markets do their thing. I mean, there's been enormous benefit to this region from open economies, from free trade, really for decades now, and that's something that my country, Australia, has experienced as well. But we are also now in a world where, no question, states are using, especially big and powerful states, are using economic levers for state power, for political and strategic advantage. How well are we doing in responding to that? How good is the adaptation? I think it's pretty uneven. And I guess at one level, what we don't want to do is have the mutually assured destitution of immediately responding with our own tariff barriers. And I know there are questions about the level of tariff barriers within and by ASEAN countries. But at the same time, we shouldn't just leave this now to market responses. So I think that what I hope to see is governments in this region, including my government, Australia's government, conferring much, much more clearly and frankly among themselves as to how to coordinate our responses.
In ASEAN, we've seen different countries. Out of 10 countries, we often talk about whether we should lean towards the US or to the China. It's always these two countries. Yeah. But how do you see that ASEAN can strike a balance between these two countries? Because at the end of the day, most of ASEAN countries are open economy. Yeah. We really depend on our trade. With Trump in power, will it change the way we do things, we do business in ASEAN? And how do you see this, and how do we strike a balance with this?
Look, I think we need to get beyond the binary of China and the United States. Now, it's easy to say that when they are the two most powerful countries in the world, without question, and quite comprehensively. But, the Trump administration, for all of its, I think, mistakes and some of its frankly disgraceful behaviour, does talk about a multipolar world, and there's truth in that. So we are in a region, in an Indo-Pacific region, where there is multipolarity. You know, Japan is very significant, the Republic of Korea, ASEAN economies themselves, Australia, the role of Europe. You know, don't forget Europe is a major trading and investment partner for the region. Yep. So I guess my starting point would be to encourage ASEAN governments to do what the Australian government is trying to do, and that is to get beyond the binary, to look for a diversification of trade and economic partners, and not seek to make a total choice to say, well, we're going to put our entire economic future in the hands of either the US or China. Then, of course, there is the strategic and military story, which we can go into if you have time.
But sometimes it's quite hard to see clarity during turbulence in that sense. But how do you view that we can see clarity during turbulence and turn it into opportunity, especially for ASEAN region? For Malaysia, for instance, we are open country, right? We trade with the US, the China, European Union, and other countries as well. But how do we build clarity in a sense?
Look, I think a starting point is to go back to national interests, to determine what is it we're seeking to achieve here. And I think in each of our countries, interests relate to, obviously, stability, prosperity, the principles that underline our society and our political systems as well. And I think to seek that clarity, increasingly there's got to be a very direct conversation between business leaders and government, including the security community, the security establishment, to look at how we can voluntarily work together for national ends. Look, I think it's great that Malaysia is seeking to show leadership within ASEAN this year as chair, but no country can be a leader if they don't have clarity in their national settings first.
Okay, and I want to see, because when I was in the World Economic Forum, we've seen a lot of people were talking about, you know, European Union, when Trump became the 47th US president, and the clarity wasn't there and isn't there at that time. But in terms of ASEAN, with over 600 million population, relatively stable union in that sense. But how do you see this strength could be the enabler factor for ASEAN to move forward in terms of, you know, determining what future ASEAN should be in dealing with other countries and region as well?
Look, I'm glad you've underscored those quite powerful statistics, because, you know, you're right. If you look at ASEAN in totality, there's an enormous amount of agency there, and if you project that, you know, into the shadow of the future, let's go forward 20 years or so, as a proportion of the global economy, that's only going to grow. That's only going to be more important. And I think that if you look at that alongside others, and I would actually bring Europe into that picture to say, well, you know, there's another economic pole there that if they can coordinate, if they can get that act together, can actually have agency in protecting the principles like free trade that are under such threat. So I think there's a leadership challenge there to seek to minimise differences, to harmonise national settings, and of course, as we know in ASEAN, one of the virtues and sometimes one of the problems of ASEAN is its consensus rule, the need to move slowly at a level sort of that's comfortable to all participants. However, I think now is a time for, I guess, a reinvigoration of purpose there for ASEAN leaders to get together, and that depends enormously on the drive and the motivation of who's in the chair.
Yeah. If we talk about the difference between global north and global south, it's quite apparent in so many levels and backgrounds as well. But how do you see that business leaders, especially, trying to understand the whole situation? Because at the end of the day, they have to think about dollar and cents, their bottom line. At the same time, they have to understand geopolitics, geoeconomics, and the policies being introduced by particular countries, advanced countries in global north and global south as well, who's impacting by whatever happens in the global north. But how do you see the whole situation for business leaders and to implement at their company, for instance, and every day, because they are the one who's actually paying for all these jobs that we are hiring?
So look, from a business perspective, and again, I speak as a security guy, so there's something in common here, and that is, you know, risk, really. It's really about anticipating and managing and mitigating risk. So these days, any self-respecting corporation is going to be relying on either geopolitical risk advice, either internally or externally, or preferably a bit of both, on every major decision. Yeah. I think there's no place here for sentiment about whether a business organisation identifies with the global south or the developed world or some other bloc. I think this should be much more about those basic calculations of risk and stability. And unfortunately, for a lot of us who've seen the United States as the place of stability for many years, we're going through a phase where that's clearly not the case. That doesn't mean, of course, that we suddenly identify, China or some other location as the obvious pillar of stability. I think we're going to need to hedge our bets, diversify, and therefore, I think for business, it's having that very clear line of geopolitical risk advice and a willingness to look at the principles that uphold a stable environment in this region. What we don't need in this region now is, having had the economic shock of the Trump tariffs, to then face some kind of strategic shock, which would put all of our prosperity at risk.
When you talk about, countries in ASEAN or ASEAN as a whole should look beyond the existing trade countries that we are having currently, and the reality on the ground. For Malaysia, I can take from Malaysia for example. When we do more trade with China, a lot of people are concerned that China will dominate us. Yeah. And at the same time, we have the issue of Gaza and Palestine, and we hate America in that sense, right? But how do we strike a balance? Because at the same time, we have the Indo-Pacific area as well. But how is the realistic, economic and also strategic partnership should be struck by ASEAN and Malaysia as the chair for ASEAN in terms of the balancing act?
Sure.
Was it hard to achieve?
Well, I think, even taking a look as an outsider at the Malaysian economy, there is reasonable diversification there. My own country, Australia, has a very large trade relationship with China, but we don't have a large investment relationship with China. Our investment relationships are much more leaning towards America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, etc. And so the diversification imperative, I think, is really number one. And other shocks, COVID, for example, I think taught us that lesson. In terms of the relationships with China, again, the Australian experience is we want a relationship that is predictable, that is stable, that's based on mutual respect, and where we protect our own interests. Now, you can have an economic relationship and still do all of that, but you need very clear settings domestically, including on issues like foreign investment, foreign interference, and so forth. It is doable, and I think that Australia and Malaysia, as middle powers in the Indo-Pacific, can actually very constructively exchange notes on how this is done, and perhaps work with others to build that ballast of middle powers in the region, because so much of the economic weight and the economic potential of the Indo-Pacific is not purely located in Beijing or Washington.
I want to talk about from the security point of view, because when I went to AWS reInvent in Las Vegas for every year, to talk about AI, the power of AI, and the same goes in during World Economic Forum, the power of AI. But all these technologies possessed by advanced countries, it's either US or China or other countries, but not from this region, ASEAN, and we are some sort of consumers in that sense for AI. But how do you see, in terms from the perspective of security, adapting to AI, because we don't want to be left behind, but we want to move forward with AI. Where are we for this region from your point of view, and how do we progress in terms of adapting AI and having its technology built from our soil?
Yeah, look, I think that is one technology, and it is an absolutely critical technology for the decades ahead. That is one technology where the choices do become starker, where I think multipolarity is less manifest. So, you're right, there is very much a US-centric ecosystem and increasingly a China-centric ecosystem. There are efforts to build other ecosystems, Europe, Japan, etc. I think the simple answer to that question is to say that we start needing to build national capability. So, for example, in Australia, at our universities, in our private sector, there's some reasonably impressive research in AI. The level of investment in that is generally not sufficient. I can't speak for the situation in Malaysia or elsewhere in ASEAN, but it would strike me that a first step is building the national base. A second step is ensuring that the legislation, that the legal protections in place are such that we can actually contribute to standards for how AI is developed and used within our countries, and there is an ethical dimension to that. And then when it comes to engaging with those big ecosystems, the US and or China or others, we can do it with our eyes open. I do think that if we go simply hell-bent for one ecosystem or the other without any national capability or national protections in place, then we are heading to a future where we're going to be diminishing our own sovereignty.
Navigating between the big brothers, for Malaysia especially, what can we learn from Australia? Because when we talk about navigating Malaysia as an open economy, we are always working closely with China and the US and the European Union, other countries as well. But what is the best practices that we can learn from Australia in that sense? Because sometimes there's always a taboo topic to be discussed in Malaysia. For instance, when in regards to Palestine, it's a no-no for Malaysia. But when it comes to our sovereignty, it's also a no-no for Malaysia. When we talk about 9-dash lines, it's very sensitive in Malaysia. But what can we learn from Australia?
Look, we're learning too. So it's a great question. But I think this is where middle powers need to learn together and need to be very honest in the conversations of sharing what they've done right, what they've maybe got wrong in their experiments, and how we can work together. Look, I think from the Australian experience, there's obviously a perception that we've had this challenge over the years of engaging with the Indo-Pacific region while also being an ally of the United States. I think our governments have done a reasonable job of managing that balance, and so just to sort of give a couple of examples of how that's worked, I think the idea of actually working with, encouraging and building a multipolar Indo-Pacific region is something that Australia has very much supported and encouraged over the years. We've done a lot more with Japan, we've done a lot more with India, we've worked with Indonesia, we've certainly looked beyond the US-China binary, while also recognising the security benefits we get from the relationship with the United States. I think it's also about having a willingness to speak very frankly, engage very frankly with those powerful actors. We've had frictions, as you know, in our China relationship over the years, but we've kept all of the national security settings that were put in place during that time while maintaining a more stable relationship with Beijing. So a lot of it boils down to the quality of statecraft, diplomacy and more, and I think that's somewhere where Australia and Malaysia should do more together.
We've seen the new world in terms of economic trajectory and in terms of security, in terms of a lot of things and aspects as well. But a lot of countries are still doing the same things of doing things and business and running the countries. But how do you see that the new reality right now have changed the way countries do things, especially in this region? Have they really, have thought about it and seen it and changed the way they do things domestically to improve themselves and to some sort of shield themselves? But do you see that this is going to be some sort of problem from this region if you are not there in terms of protecting your countries and also embracing the changes that's happening currently?
So whether we're looking at our region or we're looking globally, I think this is a time where small and middle powers need to effectively have a national interest strategy where they bring together all the elements of national power, the private sector, their security agencies and their non-security agencies alike, the strengths of civil society as well, and build really a much more coordinated national approach. You have to have that domestic resilience before you can engage as a useful partner with others. And so I wouldn't limit that conversation purely to what we do in our region, it's also what we do in the world, because although there's talk of the rules-based system being dead, there's still a lot to fight for there that has benefited countries like ours.
We've seen a lot of countries, especially the US, challenging the world body, ICC, ICJ, UN in that sense. And we've seen a lot of countries feeling hopeless. But how do you see that the middle power, such as from this region, should play an important role in balancing the whole situation?
Well, I think we need to be looking at creative middle power coalitions that are not purely of this region. So I think the relationship between ASEAN and Australia, but maybe ASEAN, Australia and Europe, Japan, Canada, there's actually quite a potent group of partners there, and it's very important that that bridges north-south as well. And it's going to be a set of coalitions that are not precisely the same on every issue. There'll be some issues, for example, where we can and should engage India as a partner, others where that may not be the case. But I think it's very important to be sending a signal that so many of our nations that have contributed to and benefited from the multilateral system over decades now are not simply going to take its diminishment lying down.
But do you think the global North understand global South better in terms of a lot of things that we try to implement? For instance, let's talk about ESG. Now, the standard that are being put that the global South should follow is as if it's very unfair for our economic growth trajectory. Yeah. Right? That's just one aspect of it. But do you think that the standard being put in a lot of things by the global North, for instance, is fair and also showing understanding from them towards a global South?
So it's always good to put this question to an Australian because we're in the South. Yeah. Even if some would identify us politically with the global North. But yeah. I think, to be honest, there's probably a lot of self-reflection at the moment in countries right across the spectrum. So looking at partners in Europe, for example, which have, I think, recognised, whether it's through all of the shocks from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, through to the shock that's now being dealt to them from the Trump administration's, frankly, abuse of its allies in Europe, there's going to be a lot of self-reflection about their priorities. And so I wouldn't be surprised if some of their diplomacy now revisits some of these issues in ways that are more sensitive to the very different circumstances of countries in other parts of the world. I think it's a fair and open conversation that needs to be had.
I want to talk about war a little bit, because those days we talk about war and military base, even now.
Yeah.
But then from this region perspectives, it's no longer about having greater military. It's about having the influence in technology, for instance, in chip making, in semiconductor, for instance. But how do you see this new age of war, having the technology, semiconductor and all that, will give you more influence, and at the same time being more powerful in the supply chain for a smaller country like Malaysia? But how do you see the whole situation in terms of security as well?
There are so many questions embedded in that. Look, I would say that some of the lessons that we've had, particularly of the Ukraine conflict in recent years, are that it is incredibly difficult for countries to wage war on their own. That they need that supporting, that enabling ecosystem. And even Russia, which seems such a formidable power in some ways, has ended up relying very heavily on China and others in its support for technology and logistics. I think when it comes to our region, to the Indo-Pacific region, when we think of the risks of conflict, and obviously the most pressing risk is the possibility of conflict across the Taiwan Strait, this is again true. I think even China, which has a view that somehow it could be an assertive military actor in a completely autarkic way, would very quickly find that if it came to a major conflict, there would be all sorts of economic dependencies that would come into play. And I think this is actually a very good argument against any country taking risk with armed conflict in our region, because the fundamental rupture to all of the economic supply chains of all of our countries would be quite immediate and quite devastating for all of our populations. Having said that, if we're looking to national defence, whether it's for Malaysia, whether it's for Australia, again, I think the view now is to look at how can we develop more capability domestically. We all, in my view, are going to see our countries increase defence spending as a proportion of GDP. We are, in my view, all going to see, I think, a much greater fusion of the military and civil infrastructure when we do that. But I don't think it's realistic for us to imagine that any of our countries can defend ourselves alone.
How important it is to have the military influence in this region? For instance, when we talk about China, so we should have US influence in the region via Philippines or Singapore in that sense. But how important it is to strike a balance by having another superpower in this region, but at the same time having ASEAN countries' population who refused to be dictated by all these two major powers in this area?
So, look, an ideal vision for this region, I think, ultimately is one where it's very clear to major powers that military aggression does not pay. And I think that's why, from a global perspective, I think one of the tragedies of the situation in Ukraine is that we've seen military aggression. But in this region, I think we have understandably wanted a balance. We've wanted, as the Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong talks about, a strategic equilibrium where no country dominates and no country is dominated by others. That's much easier said than done. I think it is vastly preferable that the United States maintains a military presence in the region, but it does it in a way that is stabilising, not destabilising, and that goes, I think, in some ways to the quality of American diplomacy. I think at the same time it makes sense for, again, the small and middle powers to build up their own capability defensively so that increasingly, if there were circumstances where we moved closer to the brink of the kind of conflict that would disrupt our region, small and middle countries could protect themselves, could help to deter conflict, could help to respond if conflict were to erupt. And I think all of this comes with the aspiration that over time the major powers, and I think China in particular, will come to realise that making threats of conflict is not going to be good for really the well-being of their own development, their own population. Because I still have the hope that we can maintain equilibrium in this region for generations to come.
My final questions.
Please.
Are we on the right track for this region in terms of embracing ourselves for geopolitical tension and uncertainty and geoeconomic uncertainty of the world? Are we on the right track in terms of working beyond the existing countries that we work currently and having more strategic partnerships and all that?
So my advice, particularly to friends in ASEAN countries, would be, please don't be complacent. I think, and I think we've had this risk in Australia sometimes in the past, that we've been too complacent. We cannot hide from the woes of the world. We've got to contribute to maintaining balance in the region. I do think that there hasn't been enough use of ASEAN institutions to try to really do what they were set up for, and that is to maintain that equilibrium. So I think whether we're on the right track or not, the direction of travel has to be, I think, much more seriousness of purpose in using the architecture that we have.
All right. Prof, thank you so much for joining AWANI. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.